Seconds after the lights went out in China, something happened that nobody expected. The FIA immediately began reviewing Max Verstappen's race start. Not after the race. Not hours later. Right there, during the sprint. And now new telemetry data from the launch of the Ford-powered RB22 is being analyzed by race control. Because according to paddock sources, the start showed something unusual in the car's behavior off the line. But here is where the story becomes even more shocking. That controversial start happened during one of the worst performances Red Bull has had in years. Max Verstappen finished 9th. Isaac Hadjar crossed the line 15th. 0 points for Red Bull. And nearly a 2-second gap to Mercedes in qualifying. For a team that dominated Formula One not long ago, those numbers are alarming. Even Verstappen himself described the car with brutal honesty. No grip, no balance, no confidence in the rear. Which raises a question the entire paddock is now asking. Did the China sprint reveal a technical problem with the RB22, or something much bigger inside Red Bull's new Ford era? Because the FIA investigation into the race start might only be the first piece of a much larger story. And by the end of this video, you will understand exactly why the China sprint could become a turning point for the entire 2026 Formula One season. Subscribe now, because what happened in Shanghai may have just changed the direction of this championship. The warning signs for Red Bull in China did not begin with the sprint race. They actually started much earlier, during sprint qualifying. And that session revealed something that immediately worried the entire Red Bull garage. Because from the very first laps in Shanghai, Max Verstappen was already on the radio. Not celebrating a strong lap. Not asking for small adjustments. Complaining about the car. Over and over again, the message was the same. No grip. No balance. And most importantly, no confidence in the rear of the RB22. For most drivers, that would already be a serious problem. But for Verstappen, it is even worse. Because his driving style depends on an extremely stable rear end. He attacks corners aggressively. He rotates the car early. He commits to the apex before most drivers even think about turning. That style only works if the car gives him confidence. And in Shanghai, that confidence simply was not there. The RB22 looked nervous through the corners. Especially through the long sweeping turns that define the Shanghai circuit. The opening sequence of turns is already one of the most demanding in Formula One. A long, tightening corner where the car must maintain perfect balance. Then comes the massive corner that leads onto the back straight. One of the longest continuous corners on the entire calendar. If the rear steps out there, even slightly, the lap time disappears immediately. And that is exactly what happened to Verstappen all weekend. Every lap looked like a fight. A fight against understeer on entry. A fight against rear instability on exit. And the numbers quickly confirmed what the driver was feeling. George Russell placed the Mercedes on pole position for the sprint. And Verstappen was almost 2 seconds slower by the time the session ended. 2 seconds. In modern Formula One, that gap is enormous. Especially when it separates teams that normally fight for the same victories. But the most worrying part for Red Bull engineers was not just the gap itself. It was how the RB22 behaved as the track conditions improved. Normally, as more rubber builds on the asphalt, the circuit gains grip. Lap times drop. Cars become easier to drive. But in China, something unusual happened. While Mercedes, Ferrari, and McLaren became faster with each session, the Red Bull did not improve at the same rate. That kind of pattern often signals a deeper issue. Possibly an aerodynamic balance problem. Or a car that operates inside an extremely narrow performance window. Meaning everything has to be perfect. The ride height. The tire preparation. The temperature. Even small changes in track conditions can suddenly make the car unpredictable. And Shanghai may have exposed exactly that weakness. Because every time Verstappen tried to push harder, the RB22 pushed back. Sliding on entry. Struggling for traction on exit. Forcing the driver to leave margin instead of attacking. And that is something Verstappen hates more than anything. Driving cautiously. By the time sprint qualifying ended, the mood inside the Red Bull garage had already changed. Not panic, but concern. Because the numbers were impossible to ignore. Nearly 2 seconds behind the fastest car. And starting only 8th on the grid for the sprint race. Which meant one thing. If the car's pace did not improve during the race, Verstappen would be trapped in the midfield. Surrounded by traffic, dirty air, and constant pressure from behind. But what nobody inside Red Bull expected was that the very start of the sprint race would soon become the center of attention for the FIA. Because seconds after the lights went out in Shanghai, something in the launch of the RB22 triggered a deeper review. The grid was ready in Shanghai. Engines were screaming. 22 cars waiting under the lights. And for Red Bull, the situation was already delicate. Max Verstappen was starting only 8th, far from the front rows where he normally begins his races. That alone created a dangerous scenario. Because starting in the middle of the pack changes everything. Dirty air. Cars attacking from both sides. No clean space to control the race. But when the lights finally went out, something immediately caught attention. Verstappen's launch. At first, it looked normal. The RB22 reacted quickly when the clutch was released. The car surged forward. But within seconds, something about the behavior of the launch began raising questions inside race control. Not because Verstappen jumped the start. Not because the car accelerated too quickly. But because the telemetry showed patterns that the FIA always reviews very carefully. In modern Formula 1, race starts are among the most controlled moments of the entire race. Every movement of the clutch is monitored. Every torque delivery from the engine is recorded. Every trace of wheel spin is analyzed. And if any value looks unusual, even slightly unusual, the FIA automatically flags it for review. That is exactly what happened in China. The start of the RB22 was placed under analysis. Not necessarily an accusation, but a technical review. And those reviews can become extremely detailed. Engine torque curves, clutch engagement timing, throttle position data. All of it compared against the regulations and the control software used by every team. But here is the detail that makes this moment even more interesting. Despite the launch drawing attention, Verstappen did not gain positions. He actually began losing them. As the field rushed toward the opening corners of Shanghai, the RB22 quickly fell into traffic. And once that happened, the problems that had appeared during qualifying became impossible to hide. The car simply did not have the pace. Through the long opening corner, Verstappen struggled to rotate the car. The rear felt unstable. The front refused to bite properly. Instead of attacking the cars ahead, he had to focus on defending. Lap after lap, the pattern repeated. Cars behind began closing in. DRS trains started forming through the midfield. And Verstappen found himself trapped in the worst place a Formula 1 driver can be. The middle of the pack. That environment destroys performance. Dirty air overheats the front tires. The aerodynamic balance collapses. And every attempt to push harder only damages the tires further. For a driver used to controlling races from the front, it becomes a frustrating experience. Meanwhile, the race leaders looked completely comfortable. Mercedes was in control. George Russell managed the race with calm precision. Ferrari remained close enough to challenge. McLaren stayed firmly inside the leading group. And Red Bull, once the dominant force of Formula 1, looked like a team fighting just to stay in the top 10. Then something else happened that could have helped them. A late safety car. Triggered after Nico Hülkenberg's retirement. Suddenly the field compressed again. A new opportunity. Fresh tires. A restart that could shake up the order. Most teams immediately took advantage of the moment. Drivers dove into the pits. Strategies changed in seconds. And for a brief moment, it looked like Verstappen might still fight for points. But when the race restarted, the same problem returned. The RB22 still lacked pace. The car still looked unstable through the corners. And Verstappen simply could not attack the cars ahead with confidence. By the time the checkered flag finally appeared over Shanghai, the result confirmed everything. Max Verstappen finished 9th, just outside the points. And his teammate Isaac Hadjar ended the sprint in 15th place after a difficult race stuck in traffic. 2 Red Bulls. 0 points. For a team that dominated Formula 1 not long ago, that result was shocking. But inside the paddock, the discussion was already moving beyond the finishing positions. Because engineers and analysts were looking at something deeper. The performance gap. Nearly 2 seconds behind the fastest cars during qualifying. A lack of balance that even Verstappen could not hide. And now, a race start that had triggered a technical review by the FIA. Put all those pieces together, and the situation becomes far more serious than a single bad sprint. Because if the RB22 truly has a deeper design problem, then Red Bull may be facing something they have not experienced in years. A car that needs major development before it can fight at the front again. And while Red Bull searches for answers, their rivals are already moving forward. Mercedes looks strong. Ferrari looks consistent. McLaren looks dangerous. Which raises a question that nobody inside the Red Bull garage wants to answer yet. What happens if the RB22 does not improve quickly enough? But the real tension after the China sprint did not come from the result alone. It came from what engineers started seeing in the data. Because when a team finishes outside the points, the first thing they do is analyze everything. Every lap, every corner, every system on the car. And in Red Bull's case, that analysis began almost immediately after the sprint ended. Engineers were studying the telemetry, comparing the RB22 against Mercedes, Ferrari, and McLaren, looking for any explanation that could justify the performance gap. And the more data they reviewed, the clearer the situation became. The RB22 was losing time almost everywhere. Corner entry, mid-corner stability, traction on exit. Each phase of the corner revealed the same weakness. The rear of the car was simply not stable enough. And when the rear becomes unpredictable, the driver loses confidence. That is exactly what Verstappen had been describing all weekend. No grip, no balance, and no reaction from the car when setup changes were applied. Normally, Red Bull is famous for its ability to solve problems quickly. Small adjustments, aerodynamic tweaks, setup changes between sessions. But in China, those adjustments did not produce the expected improvement. That is what made the engineers uneasy. Because when setup changes fail to solve a balance issue, the problem is usually deeper. Much deeper. Inside the aerodynamic concept of the car itself. And that is where the discussion inside the paddock started to become more serious. Some engineers believe the RB22 may have an extremely narrow operating window, meaning the car only works when every variable is perfectly aligned. Track temperature, ride height, tire preparation, aerodynamic load. If any of those conditions changes slightly, the performance drops immediately. And that kind of sensitivity becomes a nightmare during a long championship. Because every circuit presents different challenges, different temperatures, different corner profiles, different tire behavior. A car that only works in perfect conditions becomes unpredictable across the calendar. But there is another theory circulating inside the paddock. And this one could be even more concerning. Some insiders believe Red Bull may be dealing with a correlation problem. That means the data from the wind tunnel and simulation tools does not match what the car is doing on the track. In Formula 1, that kind of issue can slow development dramatically. Because engineers begin designing upgrades based on incorrect information. Parts that should make the car faster sometimes make it worse. And identifying that mismatch can take weeks, sometimes months.